Tonight, like Joe said, is the first of 4 series of the Diagram of Meditation. Back in last spring, we did a Living Theosophy series on meditation. The last one was on Madame Blavatsky's diagram. And I gave that, and I crammed a whole lot of stuff into one class. So what we're going to do tonight is take that and expand it into 4 classes so we can get into a little more. And then also break it up a little different. We'll spend more time on the practical aspect of meditation and what's needed in daily life, and less on the theoretical or the conceptual part. What I did when I did that talk back in the spring was I took all the literature that I could find, all the articles that I could find on the diagram, and kind of just compared what everybody said and then added some of my thoughts. So this is going to be broken up. This first one tonight is kind of the introduction and about the sitting meditation. Then in a week, we'll talk go into depth about the first acquisition and the first deprivation. Then in 2 weeks, we'll talk about the second acquisition and the second deprivation. And then in 3 weeks, we'll talk about the third acquisition and the last 3 deprivations. So that's how it will go. This is the diagram of meditation, pretty much as far as I know, as it was printed in the 1940s. This is when it first came out. It was said to be given 1887-ish, around there, and it didn't come out publicly until then. And then Pablo and I both think we reorganized this diagram at the same time. I thought I did it, and he said he did it. So we must have done it together. But we just kind of made it prettier and easier to read than that old typewriter font. Tonight, basically, what we'll cover, if I have the right thing, is this right here. This part, and then the note down here. And then the second page are the deprivations, and we'll cover this part of the note right here, just so you have an idea where we're coming from. And for those of you on the internet, this will be on Pablo's website to download, so you can have the diagram, and the PowerPoint will also be up there. So the PowerPoint from the last diagram back in the spring, the way I set it up was really kind of a study. You could use the PowerPoint as a study from there. I put the full quotes down and some extra information that if you, that'll be on the website also if you'd like to go back and review or use it as a preview. So some theosophical context first. Pablo does a great job of talking to crowds that are both theosophical and non-theosophical. When I talk, I assume everybody loves theosophy and everybody knows something about it. So what I did tonight was just add a little context to start with. All right, so in the theosophical literature, man is known to have a dual nature. We have a higher nature, which is our spiritual nature, and we have our lower nature, which is our sensations, our emotions, our thoughts, our desires, our memories, those parts of us. And then the idea is the more we tap into that higher nature, the more we can reach universal brotherhood. And I think there's a quote in here that our whole goal is to reach this universal brotherhood on the inner planes, or on those or from that spiritual nature. An inner revolution versus a social revolution. We've seen social revolutions. We've seen politics. We've seen wars. We've seen all kinds of things that try to change the external. And I don't think any of them have really been lasting or effective. So what the theosophical literature says is that there's an inner revolution that we need to work on. That will create that inner transformation that will create the change we want to see in the world. Okay, the ultimate goal in Theosophy is the occult path to discipleship. a lot for me. This was important for me to remember because one of the things it says that when you're on a path of any sort and you come across difficulties and there is suffering, to take them joyfully. Well, that never made sense. It never sat well with me. I didn't understand it. But then it was explained to me that joyfulness is something that's an ultimate goal, to be able to take that suffering or take that path and do it joyfully. While we're working towards that goal, sometimes we'll be a little more joyful, other times we'll be a little less joyful.
For those who may not be aware of what is meant by the path of discipleship and this theosophical concept, the idea is that spirituality, there are two roads of spiritual growth. We can grow by a natural, gradual development of morality and virtues and understanding, or those who are more earnest, or not, I wouldn't say more earnest, those who are harried, that don't want to spend so much time growing little by little, there is a possibility of, because of that very earnestness, there is a possibility of growing faster, in the sense of, in all traditions there is the idea of a sudden path and a gradual path. The idea is that life, as we all know, has moments of joy and moments of suffering. But as we awaken to our spiritual nature, we develop the ability to dwell more on that aspect of ourselves that is the source of harmony. And at a certain point in our growth as a soul, the soul decides to try to dwell in that spiritual aspect as much as possible. That doesn't mean to retire from the world. As we are going to see, the diagram of meditation provides a way to lead our spiritual life in daily life. But the idea is that the soul yearns for this state of union, of unity or peace or harmony, to be in its own true nature. So in the theosophical literature, it is stated that when a person or when a soul begins to have this yearning, then life begins to organize itself in a way that will present the different learning lessons that the soul needs in a more orderly way, so that the soul can discover its true nature faster than just by going little by little. So it's a whole concept that we cannot go into, but the idea is that the Theosophical Society is trying to present the possibility of this faster path, which implies more effort in a certain sense. It's just like you want to learn to play the violin really well, then you dedicate to that, and then you put more effort, but then you can master the instrument. Or if you are okay with just playing a little, that's also fine.
Or a school, somebody who graduates from high school when they're 13 and goes on to college and graduates from college when they're 17. That's more of an accelerated.
Yeah, it's a difficult subject to explain in a few minutes, because then it looks like a spiritual ambition. It's not like that, but we will develop that a little more during the talk.
But to hold off somebody who could progress through school that quickly, to make them take the slower route, would be frustrating to them in essence. So, and then just the last one is Annie Besant called them the 3 pillars of Theosophy, and that's study, meditation, and service. And the diagram of meditation incorporates all 3 of these. All right. Okay, so why should we practice this? Why should we study Theosophy? Why should we be on the spiritual path? I just picked out part of this quote from Madame Blavatsky, and she stresses, only the weakening of the feeling of separateness, and such a weakening can only be achieved by a process of inner enlightenment. It is only by the close brotherly union of men's inner selves of soul solidarity, of the growth and development of that feeling which makes one suffer when one thinks of the suffering of others, that the reign of justice and equality for all can ever be inaugurated. This is the first of the three fundamental objects for which the Theosophical Society was established, and called the Universal Brotherhood of Man without distinction.
So the idea, as Michele said, is that the aim in all this is to produce this inner revolution, because only by changing our hearts and our minds, the world will change. We keep trying to change these external systems, but if we are still greedy, selfish, fighting each other, we will corrupt any system. So to produce peace in the world, to produce a change, we have to change our hearts. Our hearts, and help each other to see ways so that each person that is willing to undergo this path can also work on themselves.
Okay, the goal of the diagram of meditation. The name is a misnomer. This is not just a diagram of meditation, it's more of a whole yoga, a spiritual path. It involves not only sitting meditation, but also development of very specific attitude for our daily life. The sitting meditation is a small part. We're going to see that it's the beginning, and then there's some of it at the end, and but most of it is, and this unity, this meditation on unity is the foundation, but most of it is stuff that we can do throughout our day. The whole purpose of the diagram is to shift our perception from the idea that we are this separate, limited entity to the idea that we are the whole. Once we realize that we are the whole, that we are more than this personality, then a shift becomes, and then things open up that we can tap into more. Okay? All right. So the general structure, and I kind of went over this already. This is both today's structure. We'll start with the sitting meditation, the meditation on unity, and then there's a line in there about the states of consciousness. And then in our daily life, we'll work on the acquisitions and the deprivations. The bottom half will be more of what comes in the next 3 weeks. All right, the sitting meditation. Dora Kuntz says that it has much deeper aspects. Its greatest potential benefit lies in the fact that it offers the possibility of access to dimensions of consciousness which lie beyond the personal self. Meditation may be said to have a twofold purpose. It is a way of relating to the deeper aspects of one's own nature, but it is not only that. It is also a way of relating oneself to a much greater reality which we can think of under different guises, as unity, underlying nature, or the spiritual dimension, or God.
So as Michele said, we all have a spiritual nature, or we are this spiritual nature that is incarnated in a particular personality. So through meditation, first, we can discover this spiritual nature. In daily life, we are normally focused on our personal nature, our personal needs, our desires, the need to take care of our body. It is through the spiritual life that we can begin to look at the spiritual aspect of ourselves. So meditation is one of the avenues, as Michele mentioned before. Meditation, study, and service, they are all necessary. We are talking about meditation in particular here. And meditation is a way first to discover that spiritual aspect in us. But then eventually we discover that that spiritual aspect is really a unity with the reality that underlies the universe. So the aspirant discovers that there is this unity, and we are just an expression of this unity.
The first part of the diagram says, first conceive of unity by expansion in space and infinite in time, either with or without self-identification.
So this is how the diagram starts. Blavatsky proposes that the first thing we do is to try to conceive this state of unity. So there are different techniques as to how we can meditate on unity. And the idea is that, as I was saying, because we are focused on the personal nature, we cannot perceive that other subtler aspect of our being. It's just like when you drink a coffee with too much sugar, then if you get the coffee without sugar, you just cannot taste, the beauty that may be there, because that sugar is overcoming the taste of the coffee, for example. So in this case, because we are too much focused on the personality, then we cannot taste the spiritual aspect. So the first idea is to try to meditate on that aspect, the aspect of unity. And there are different ways. What Blavatsky recommends here is a meditation in which we try to expand our consciousness, she says, in space and time, and then go beyond, as we are going to see. But we will show you an example of one way in which this technique is approached.
This is from Clara Codd, and what she does basically is she has you start and lift your consciousness or your awareness to the top of your house, and then encase that whole house, and then go beyond there to where you finally come down. Now look into the world's invisible, pierce the light. And it's very nicely, poetically written for that. To have, but there are other meditations on expansion that can be done. One of them that I have tried before is I think of a bubble and I try to expand it and see where it goes or how far out it will go. And it's funny because I noticed that when I was doing this and I was doing it in the house, I could get the bubble to go so far, and then it would come back. And then I would try to expand it a little more. But I was at one of my son's soccer games, and I thought, well, I'll practice here. And I did it, and it felt like it just went so much further. So I don't know if it was because I was out in nature or for whatever reason it happened. But I kind of played with it. And then I noticed that I couldn't expand anything behind me, that it would only go out in front. So I really had to work on that. So it was just something that I did to work on, being in space.
Yes, as we are going to see, Blavatsky later on explains how this exercise of trying to expand, first you start in imagination, because that imagination is a tool that is used many times in the spiritual work, because it is through imagination that we begin to generate a different mental image. The mental images that we have, they become a hindrance to our perception. When you have a concept about the world, that very concept filters the reality, and you tend to interpret reality in that way. So the first thing that you start doing in meditation is trying to generate a different concept, a different image. This is a very preliminary stage, but it's in order to counteract the image that we are this particular personality, that our consciousness is enclosed within this particular space. So in meditation, you try to feel that you embrace more. And eventually, as you practice, you really begin to have the feeling that your sphere of consciousness is not limited to the body. Your sphere of consciousness is wider. So that is the first step that Blavatsky proposes, and then, as we are going to see in the following weeks, that attitude has to be translated or taken to our daily life, and she will explain briefly what transformations can happen in consciousness as we do this.
This second one, the last one here said "and time." I couldn't find any meditations that were written on time, but I did hear one from Pablo. Did this talk out in California. You said go back in time and go back to a place where you've always been, or your awareness is where you've always been, and then come here to the present time, and you're not just only here, but you're in the past and then in the future.
Yes, these are all meditation. The techniques of meditation are always only just a help to begin, but meditation has to be creative. Meditation is an effort at perceiving things in a different way. So you can play with these things. Our consciousness is based on the concepts of space and time. And that's the personal consciousness. You know, Kant, for example, the philosopher, he would say that's part of the structure of consciousness. You cannot perceive something without perceiving it in terms of space and time. So that is true for the personal consciousness. The spiritual consciousness is beyond these concepts. So what all these exercises try to do is to make us try to perceive different. When we try, we are calling up this different perception. If we never knock at the door, that perception remains dormant. But when we try, then we are waking up that perception. So meditation is something that we do as an exercise. It's not a real state of consciousness. It's a time in which you try to awaken something true, and then you bring it to your daily life, and you try to establish it there, as we are going to see.
All right, so then the second line of the diagram says, then meditate. Yes. Okay.
So the reason why this will eventually work is because the truth is we are this expanded consciousness already. Mm-hmm. And we're just blocking ourselves from seeing it. So it's already an established fact. We just have to discover it for ourselves.
Right. We just have to use less sugar in our coffee each day until we can truly taste the coffee.
Yeah, I don't know why I gave that example. I don't even drink coffee. But that is a good point in the sense that we are not trying to create something that is not there. With all these exercises, we are trying to, it's like when you are sick, you are taking a medicine. The idea of the medicine is not to create health. Is to counteract what is preventing you from being healthy. So it goes, attacks the illness, and then the body naturally falls into health. All these things are spiritual medicine that are trying to counteract the wrong assumptions that we have, the limited perception that we have generated, so that by counteracting them, then the true state, which is this state of unity, will start being perceived by our consciousness, our waking consciousness.
Okay, so now the second line of the diagram there says, then meditate logically and consistently on this, and these were my words, I put unity in because I forget a lot of times, so I like to be reminded exactly what this and that is. But meditate logically and consistently on this in reference to the states of consciousness. Now, from the literature that I read, everyone talks about the general states of consciousness that are given in the Voice of the Silence that come from Hinduism. We did that here. I did that in the other talk, but we're going to show something a little different also. So this is a quote from the Voice of the Silent. The three states of consciousness are Jagrat, the waking, Svapna, the dreaming, and Shushupti, the deep sleeping state. These three yogi conditions lead to the fourth, or the Turiya, that beyond the dreamless state, the one above all, a state of high spiritual consciousness. So here is a table that we put together. It starts out here with the four states, just as I read them in the Voice of the Silence, and then Pablo put them here together with the principles as we know them in Theosophy.
Yeah, and we can explain what they are as we read them. So
read them right now?
Yeah.
Okay, so the Jagrat, or the waking state, is the physical body, the Linga Sharira, and Prana.
Well, no, yeah, that's the awareness that we have while in the body. We are in the body right now. This is our waking state,
okay,
in which we are aware of.
Right, and we're aware of external things. Then in the Svapna, or the dreaming state, is the principle connected with is kama manas, and this is awareness of internal objects. So we're aware of our thoughts.
Yeah, so in Theosophy, kama manas is our mind, the mind that is entangled with emotions. This is what we are in touch with when we are dreaming. When we are dreaming, we relate to a whole world that is actually a creation of our mind and emotions and the sensations that we receive during the day. So the state of dreaming is related to our mind and to internal objects, things that our mind generates.
Sushupti, the deep sleep state, buddhimanas, and aware of no objects. And I'll explain this last column a little more because that part itself was real awakening for me.
So buddhimanas in Theosophy is this spiritual aspect in ourselves. It's a source of wisdom. And when we are in deep sleep, we think that we are unconscious. You know, when we wake up, we don't remember anything. We say, I was in a deep sleep and there was nothing there. But that is just because our consciousness, our waking consciousness, is not subtle enough to remember that state of, that spiritual state. That state that where there are no objects, in the sense that consciousness transcended the physical world, transcended the world of the mind, and it's closer to its own nature, that is more a state of unity. Now, in most of us, our consciousness is not able to remember that state of unity. That's why when we wake up, we don't remember anything. We say, I was just unconscious, I was in sleep. But through the spiritual practice, we may become aware of all these states.
And then Turiya, the beyond state, Atma, is connected with the Atmic principle. Yes?
So could we also conceive of this as consciousness on various planes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is the idea. What we are presenting here is the correlation that Blavatsky made. Usually she talked about the principles of consciousness more than the planes, but you can correlate them. And Atma is the idea, is this universal self. An enlightened being becomes aware of this universal self, and he becomes aware that he is the universal self, that every one of us are an expression of this universal self. That is what Atman is. And in that state, when the enlightened being is in that state, he transcends all these different states of consciousness. He's in a different state in which all these lower states are integrated.
Okay, so Pablo's going to talk about a way that he was able to apply this to our daily life. Because I asked him, I said, what? So, okay, so I know that stuff. How does it, help me? And then, so the last column, the awareness column, I read an article, not an article, a little snippet that talked about in the Jagrat state, if you think about it as the state of external objects or the waking state, in our waking state we have a lot of distraction going on. We have physical distraction just by things. We have our desires, we have our emotions, we have our thoughts, we have our memories. So there's a lot of discord in that state. And then in the svapna state, or the dreaming state, if we think about that as when we're dreaming, all of our external things are gone. So the things that we're looking at are gone. The desires, those things that are physical are gone. And it's more just the stuff that's within us. In the third state, the deep sleep state, we're not aware of any object. So the thoughts, the emotions, the desires are all gone from there. And then the Turiya state is where our awareness is beyond all three. But it was really important when I read, for me, to realize that we don't just transcend it and drop it all, but we transcend it and we integrate, or we assimilate all these other states together.
Yeah, so this can be seen as a description of the progress in our spiritual life. The first thing we have to try to do is to be aware, in the sense of being awakened to the external world. When we go through life, we are many times relating to life, but from our thoughts, we are not really aware of what we are doing, of the objects, we are distracted. So the first stage is to become aware, develop awareness in your dealing with the world. Then, as you grow into that, you begin to pay attention also to your internal activity. So you are not only aware of the physical world, you are aware of your emotions, of your thoughts, of that inner world, the world of internal objects. And then as you keep practicing this, you will become able to be in a state of silence where there are no thoughts or feelings or emotions when you don't need them. You know, we are walking and our mind is constantly thinking when we don't need to be thinking. So with the practice of awareness first of the external, then on the internal, you begin to establish your consciousness in this state of silence, and you can be silent and in this peaceful and harmonious state of consciousness while you are awake, when you don't need to think. And then as you establish your consciousness there, then the further possibility will open that is transcending this and in that state, when you transcend the three states of consciousness, there is a state in which no matter what you are doing, you are in this state of pure awareness. No matter if you are thinking or not, if you are acting or not, there is this state that pervades all the different states. So that's more or less what these four states of consciousness mean in Hinduism. Of course, we are throwing light on that concept from the theosophical point of view, but the origin of the four states of consciousness is from Hinduism.
The other thing I wanted to add was these are also the four stages that we go through when we meditate. So the first state is the concentration state. When we sit down and we're trying to gather our things together, there's a lot going on. We're aware of the external noises. We're aware of if the lights dim, even if our eyes close, we notice those things. So our objective is to get beyond that, to go to the second stage, which is the meditation stage. And that's when we're able to shut out everything around us, and then we're able to just pay attention to what's inside, all right? Then we pay attention to our thoughts and our ideas. And then eventually, as we shift and we start finding more gaps, I call them gaps of silence. And I really don't have silence, but I have gaps in the thoughts, which are the silence. And so as we're able to extend those gaps, then we go into the contemplative state. And that contemplative state is where we are aware of no objects. We are aware of that there's silence. And then eventually, as we practice and get better, we move from awareness of the silence to where we move beyond that to where we just be. I remember when I noticed that silence first in me. It was first when I was in a meeting. I used to be a teacher, and I was in a teacher meeting, and we always talk a lot. Teachers make the worst students. So there was a gap between when no one was talking, and I noticed my mind all of a sudden kicked in and was trying to find something to start talking about because it wasn't used to that silence, it wasn't used to that quietness. And so I tried to start noticing that. And then when you stop gossiping or talking, complaining, or worrying about things, there's really not a whole lot to talk about. So you have to get used to that. For me, I had to get used to that silence. Ed has a question.
So instead of focusing on trying to maintain silence, which is, you could say, advanced or not even necessary, you could notice the coming and going of thoughts. If you start noticing the coming and going of thoughts, you'll also start noticing the gaps between the thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it's not necessary to get rid of thoughts, just to notice the nature of thought. Right. And how useful it is or how unuseful it is.
And that's part of the work in the swapna state, where we begin to be aware of the workings of our mind and our emotions, and then we start learning, we start noticing its nature, and we start noticing all this, how it arises and stays and then disappears, and the gaps. And the more we become aware of that, the gaps naturally expand.
I always explained it with Newton's law, I don't know which one, but the law that says for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, second law. So the harder I try to push those thoughts away, the harder and faster they come back at me. So
awareness is a gentler way to go.
Yes. Okay, so this is what Pablo explained. So, and this is written really nicely. I really liked this part here to give an explanation of it. Okay, so here we start with the note at the bottom of the front page. Okay, the note says, the acquisition is complete with the conception, I am all space and time. Beyond that, it cannot be said.
So we'll see that Blavatsky proposes, she called them acquisitions, a kind of attitude towards life that we have to develop, to acquire. I don't know that acquire is the best word, but to develop. And then she says that this effort should be completed by this kind of meditation. I'm in all space and time, but there is a beyond that she says it cannot be said, in the sense that anything that we can, as we are going to see, that we can do with our minds is still within the field of the mind. And all these kind of exercises help us to get away from the more restrictive aspect of our mind. But eventually, we have to go beyond anything that can be said or explained. And you learn that in consciousness, in meditation, for example, when you are trying to, when you begin to be more used to staying in this silence, in between the gaps of the thoughts, even if it is a couple of seconds, you begin to discover that there is a state that is beyond explanations, beyond words, beyond the effort that you can make. So she says that this is part of the meditation that we have to do, and at the end we'll show you a little technique that you can develop with what Blavatsky is saying here.
Okay, here Jeffrey Hudson kind of sums it up. He says, you can think your way up to the threshold of unity, but you cannot cross it by thought alone. To get behind consciousness with consciousness is impossible. You need a higher organ, another instrument of consciousness. Before the center of awareness and observation in man can reach this condition where unity is obvious and see the uniting principle, three mental procedures are necessary. A, think your way towards the principle of oneness as far as you possibly can.
So that is the first part where you meditate on expansion, for example. You do it and try to generate this feeling of oneness as much as possible.
B, then still the mind so that it does not interfere. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and he quotes, be still and know that I am God, or the different quotes that talk about the stillness and how in the stillness we can perceive the reality.
I like the one where Jesus stills the water. He just commands it, peace, be still.
Yeah, and that the water is like a symbol of the personality, the emotions and thoughts.
Okay, and C, focus the center of awareness above the mind, above division into unity, affirming unity with God and the becoming mentally still. Do the last two in imagination until, by practice, it becomes possible to transfer the center of consciousness from the form to the formless level, from the phenomenal to the noumenal universe, from effects to causes. Pablo has a quote, fake it till you make it. I hate that quote.
It's not mine. It's
but I hate when he says that quote because I'm thinking, I can't fake it. But it says it everywhere that it's something that you just have to try, you have to do, you have to make the attempt. And once you do that, then you have to cross the room, you have to put your hand on the doorknob, you have to click it open. And once you open it, then things open up for you.
Yeah.
And this
but that's the way we learn to do anything. When you are learning to ride the bicycle or to do anything, you start doing it as if you knew how to. You just get on the bicycle and you try to do it as if you knew, and then you fall. But by trying, eventually you can do it. So in these three stages, as you can see, in the first, you use your imagination. The second, you try to remain still. And in the third step, pay attention to that stillness. When he says, he talks more in a kind of occultist language or yogic language, but the idea is to pay attention to that silence, try to merge with that silence. And then eventually the state of consciousness of this kind of unity will happen.
Okay, now we go to the bottom of the other side of the page, and the last part of that says, deprivation is completed by the meditation, I am without attributes.
So we are selecting these parts because these are the parts where Blavatsky recommends something to do in meditation. Then, as we are going to see, all the rest is to do in daily life. So what we did is to bring together all the different parts where she talks about sitting meditation.
Okay.
So in this one, the other aspect that we have to meditate on is the idea I am without attributes. So what does it mean?
This one's from Nisargadatta.
Nisargadatta Maharaj is a modern sage. He died in 80-something, 81, I think. And he was a modern sage in India. And he has a very famous book, I Am That. And he talks about this quite a bit. So there are a couple of quotes by him.
All you can tell about the person is not the self, and you can tell nothing about the self. All attributes are personal. The real is beyond all attributes. Once you have understood that you are nothing perceivable or conceivable, that whatever appears in the field of consciousness cannot be yourself, you will apply yourself to the eradication of all self-identification as the only way that can take you to a deeper realization of yourself. You literally progress by rejection. And this is the deprivations that Blavatsky, the name that Blavatsky gives it.
Yeah, so the idea with this is anything we can perceive at the level of the mind belongs to the mind. The real self is beyond the field of our mind. The mind is an instrument of the self, but it's just when we try to imagine God. We imagine God as a human being that lives in heaven as if heaven were a physical plane. We transfer what we know onto a reality that is unknown. So that's what our mind does. When our mind tries to see, okay, what am I? All we can think of, all we can try to imagine was built or is built with the elements that the mind has. But our reality is actually beyond all this. So the other way to get to our reality is by rejecting anything that we know. As we reject everything that we know, what is left behind or afterwards is closer to what we really are. And there is a little example by Annie Besant. Yes.
So with the second quote, there is something that says eradication of all self-identification. Is self-identification equivalent to what's self-personality in the Mahatma letters?
Yeah, the idea is, there is this spiritual self that is working through a mind, emotion, and body, and then naturally, as it assumes, I am this body, I am this mind, these emotions. And when we identify with that, then the self is limited to the mind, the emotions, and the body. So these are vehicles of expressions of the self, but as long as the self is identified with them, it cannot use it as a vehicle. Rather, the mind and the emotions are, dragging the self here and there, if we want to put it that way. So the first step is to break the identification, to know that there are thoughts, but that are beyond the thoughts. So when there are thoughts that are negative, let's say, one can remain apart from them.
Detached.
Yeah, detached from them. And the same with emotions and everything. So there is a process of breaking the identification that is necessary.
Or disidentification.
Yeah. And this meditation that we are going to see is one way to work on this.
It's said a lot of different ways. The names, there's many different ways that are given to the personality.
There is no universal spiritual language.
Yeah, they say say a small, the self, when it's written with a small s, some people refer that to the personality, but then
in Sanskrit, you don't have capital letters, for example, so if there is something translated. So there is no universal spiritual language, and there is no universal philosophical language. Intuition in one philosopher will be different from the intuition in another. We have to assign meanings. So you have to try to see that particular author, what he means by that word.
Okay, the next quote by Annie Besant says, "The plane of Atma is the region of being, where all is reality, where true consciousness resides. We are to seek this way by study of our inmost being. We begin to search for it by trying to realize its existence. You can only do so by a series of negatives. You think, is this phenomenal? It is not so. Is it intellectual? It is not so. You seek it by eliminating what it is not. You then say, it is not a thing that the senses can perceive. It is not what the intelligence can imagine. It is not found even by the illuminated intelligence, with its vast extent, and so on."
So she's explaining briefly a whole method of meditation. The idea is, if you look for the self, you start saying, okay, it's not in the body, so let go of the idea of the body. Suppose that you can let go of all sensations. Then you look at the emotion and you say the emotions are always changing and this self is permanent. So it's not in the emotion, so you let go of the emotions. Then in your thoughts, again, the self is beyond the thoughts, so you let go of the thoughts. So what is left? What is left when you let go of your physical sensations, emotions, memory, thoughts? What is left there? Whatever is left is the reflection of the self. So Annie Besant will show it in the next.
"And so you shut out part after part until perchance nothing seems left, for you find that all is changing and you seek the real and the changeless. But in that emptiness that you have made, in that void whence the unreal has disappeared, then arises upon you the higher consciousness, the deathless, the unchanging, the eternal."
So this is a technique of meditation that sometimes is called the Via Negativa or the Neti Neti. Neti Neti is a Sanskrit word that means this not, this not. To discover the real, since we said anything the mind can imagine is part of the mind elements, to discover the real, you begin to reject anything that you perceive. And then in that silence, you open the door for what is higher. Most of the Christian mystics, for example, use this approach. They say, as long as you are speaking, God cannot speak. As long as you are in love with yourself, you cannot love God. So the idea is, when you let go of your identification with the personality, with your body, emotions, thoughts, then you open up your consciousness to perceive something higher. If you are full of yourself, then you cannot perceive something higher.
And once again, the meditation to do with this is something to play around with. Pretend you're a flower peeling its petals back, or an onion and you're peeling past the peels of onion, that yucky stuff, to get to something good in the center.
So with all these elements, we can generate a little method of meditation. So first, you try to conceive this unity by expansion and feeling that you are one. Start, as Michele said, with the room. Feel that you are the space of the room and that everything is in the field of your consciousness. Then you can keep expanding it little by little and try to generate this sense of unity. That is the first step. Then from that point of view, from the point of view of unity, Blavatsky says, meditate on the states of consciousness. So either you work on the state of consciousness that we described, in Hinduism, but for that you need some study and you need to be familiar with that. Or the other option is, from this view of unity, meditate on your normal states of consciousness. For example, when you are afraid, how would you see something of which you are afraid, or with something that you are upset about? How do you perceive it if you have this idea that you are the unity and that you are eternal? Because there are a lot of little things that upset us and that have upset us in the past, and that then we forget, and they didn't make any difference in our life, but at that moment they were important. So if we can generate this state of awareness of eternity, awareness of unity, from that point of view, examine something in your daily life and see how you see it from that point of view. And then the next step would be now try to reach the true self by letting go of your identification with any attribute. So you can do that little meditation that we saw, that we explained. Look at your body, feel your sensations, and then if you are perceiving the sensations, it means that you are beyond that. So you let go of the sensations of, heat or it itches, so you just retreat your awareness. You say, here is not the root of the self. Then you look at your emotions. The emotions are constantly changing again, and since you are aware of the emotions are separate from you. You are something that is behind. So you let go of the emotions. Then you look at your thoughts, and then again you let go of your thoughts. And then you stay in that silence. Then you will see that in silence there are elements that at the beginning you didn't perceive. But again, as soon as you perceive them, you let go of that. And that is a process that will take you eventually beyond any attribute. And that's where you have to try to end up, in going beyond anything that you can perceive and remaining in silence for 3 seconds, for a minute, or for whatever happens. And you can come again and do the process again. So this is more or less like the foundation for what Blavatsky is going to propose for us to do during our daily life. If you meditate, and you don't need to meditate to start by meditating on this half an hour. Start with 5 minutes if you don't have the practice of meditation. Start 5 minutes, and then enjoy the practice, take it playfully, see where it takes you, what you can see, what you cannot see, and that practice will naturally grow by itself. You don't need to struggle. And then that will set a foundation for the practice that we are going to see in the next weeks.
Okay, yeah.
So, a question online. How do we know if our meditation is working?
You don't know, or I can say I don't know. But I think it's just like anything. How do you know if you start an exercise program that exercise program is working? Or how do you know if you're eating right, if that eating program or the diet is working? Eventually you'll notice, people say when they stop eating gluten, that, my head's not quite as foggy, or I'm able to stay awake longer. And for me, I'll speak just personally, I don't notice a whole lot when I meditate. To me, I'm just sitting there struggling. But every now and then I'll catch something that is a glimpse that I've gone another step, or that I'm sitting longer. I'm able to sit still and not fidget the whole time. So in the beginning, there are those little, for me, there didn't seem like there was much of a change. But then eventually you'll get just a flash of something.
Yeah, with anything we start, there is a lag time until we can see some results. I mean, the deeper answer to this is that the question it shouldn't be there, but it's always there. We all always ask that question. But the idea with meditation is that meditation works on the inner planes, especially this kind of meditation, works more on our higher nature than the lower. There are 2 ways to affect your nature. You do something on your lower nature, and usually you see effects that are more immediate. There are meditations that tend to produce relaxation, and you can see that very easily. But the effect of a superficial relaxation is only lasts while you are doing that technique. Then you go out and you are stressed out as always. But there are some, of course it is useful. I'm not saying it's not useful at all, but it all depends on the depth of the effect. The effects that are superficial are very easy to see. But the kinds of meditations where you are trying to go beyond your personality, what they are doing is, if we can put it this way, generating like a dwelling place in your higher nature, so that your awareness can begin to dwell there and to go through lights from there. And that is a process that you cannot perceive from your lower nature. Little by little, you will see, and little by little, maybe a few years, you will see that you are able to be calmer, or to be more detached, or whatever way that may express in you. But the spiritual path requires patience, as any other path, but especially the spiritual path requires patience, because it works on our true nature that we are not perceiving. And that very patience is part of the path, because the aspect that wants to progress and to evolve and to grow is the personal ego, which is not real. The personal ego is actually an obstruction. The way it works at the moment, at least, is an obstruction for the self. So the very fact of going on without seeing results is working on challenging the lower ego. That's why I said, do this meditation in a playful way, not with ambition, not with seriousness of I have to get something from it. That is the lower self, the one that wants to get something. I want my money's worth, So do it playfully. It's an adventure in consciousness. Try to explore and see what you discover.
And what helped me think of that is our inner planes are more subtle, and our physical is more denser, so it takes more energy to move dense matter than it does subtle matter. So to me, that was something that made the connection that I'm not going to see it physically on the physical plane. Then it doesn't necessarily mean it's not working on the inner planes.
If what we are to seek through meditation has no attributes, how does it differ from nothing?
Yeah, it's basically a difference in a state of consciousness. We call nothingness to a state which is beyond the attributes, but of which we are not aware. But through the process of the spiritual life, we come back to this nothingness with full awareness, and then we see that nothingness is also a fullness. This is a problem, in Buddhism, they talk about emptiness or shunyata. So they describe this as an emptiness of things. And in Hinduism, they call it purna, which is fullness. And what you see is that when you get to those states of silence, for example, the silence is completely empty, but since it is empty of problems, empty of suffering, empty of the personal self, it's full of an inherent harmony. So it's empty of what is unreal, and therefore it is the real. And that's what happens with this. When the attributes, any attributes are limitations. If a chair is blue, it means that it's not red, it's not green, it's not any other color. So any attribute we have is denying all the other possibilities. We identify ourselves with our attributes, and therefore we limit ourselves. When we go beyond attributes, then we are in this state of infinite potentiality, which in itself produces a completely different state of consciousness.
Do you have a question, or you want another drink?
Both.
Okay.
The cup is nothing surrounded by something. You need both the emptiness and the something for it to be useful.
Right. Yeah. Someone made with a vase. who made that? Yes, I read something, a distinction with the vase. But it's also something, I don't think we have the vehicle to appreciate nothingness. You know, for me, I think that I have to be constantly going in order to be productive. And at some point I realized that if I slowed down, and I could get more done than doing things, you know, in a hurried way. So I just in that physical example, I needed the maturity to realize that slowing down was good. So the same thing, yeah, you can't have anything that's empty if you don't have something to have it that's empty.
So the other thing is, it sounds like this is something you do by yourself. And if you only do it by yourself, you probably won't be very successful. You really need a support structure, like the Theosophical Society, or a group of people that encourages you and points out, you know, you keep going and you're doing great, and you need universal brotherhood to get the universal brotherhood.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, because someone needs to explain to you about that lag time, you know, that you're not just doing it for nothing. Or it's nice to explain to you that, you know, that you're doing this and, oh, that's completely normal on this path.
Yeah, and the idea of Sangha now is also quite pretty much in the awareness of the spiritual seekers, and I think this is a reaction to the individualism that we are generating in our culture. On one hand, we are becoming more and more individualistic, and we can learn all this online or in our house. But on the other hand, we are discovering what Ed is saying, that there is something that happens when we come together and we work together. So the only way we can really establish this universal brotherhood is by being together, not just by thinking that we are one with everything. Of course, thinking that we are one with everything may open an avenue, but then we have to stabilize that in our consciousness, as we are going to see in the next weeks, and actually try to embody the idea. And only then you really perceive it in its full extent.
Then there's the other end of the continuum, that we want a specific technique. We want to know exactly what we do every time. And as we can see from this, there isn't any set method. I could try to do Pablo's meditation and get nothing out of it, where my mind's more creative and I want to unfold like a flower. You know, he may actually see the, you know, the physical and the emotional and the thoughts peel away, and I want my flower unfolding. So we, like he said, you really have to play with it or be creative or use what's yours. And that's one of the downsides of the Theosophical Society, is that it doesn't give you a specific technique for us that want instructions, and all we want to do is follow the instructions. And if I get from instruction 1 to instruction 10, I will know exactly what I'm going to get. So there's some of that where we. Ah, that's it. Okay, we got it in. Task-oriented monkey mind.
Yeah, so there is a balance. There are certain principles that we can learn from each other, but we always have to apply those principles to our lives. Blindly following a technique doesn't work. I mean, it can produce some superficial results, but to break through our wrong identification requires a lot of creativity. So we can apply the general principles, but then we have to do it with applying our own creativity.